The New York Times characterized the rule as the most significant policy change on the issue in more than 30 years. And you've never heard of it, right? Hearing of this rule, though, Paul Vallis, who has headed school systems in Louisiana, Philadelphia, and Chicago, this is what he predicted. He said, you're going to see a proliferation of single-sex schools. Now, it's really hard to figure out how many there are right now. But South Carolina has indicated that it now has 200 single-sex schools. The National Association for Single-Sex Public Education claims that the number rose from 11 in 2002 to 540 in 2009. I don't know about their math. How could there be 200 in South Carolina? I don't know. Anyway, there's been an explosion of single-sex schools and classrooms. So now, explanations. What explains the resurgence of proposals for and experiments with single-sex education? What lessons should we take from this development? I offer 4 hypotheses and look forward to your explanations and assessments. First, advocates point to new research claiming brain and biological differences. Second, there are growing concerns about the status and educational progress of boys, and single-sex education seems like a response. Third, single-sex schooling may be a reaction to the increasing sexualization, meaning imposition of sexual images and on increasingly younger children. And fourth, single-sex schooling may represent a conception of school reform uniquely tied to differences in race, religion, and class. And parental preferences along these lines may be assisted by school choice. Let me elaborate on each of these briefly. So first, new research or recycled stereotypes. If the 20th century was the age of physics, the 21st is the age of biology. Functional magnetic resonance imaging allows for real-time mapping of blood flow changes related to neural activity and other tools of brain research. The new tools suggest that men's brains, on average, are larger than female brains. On average, men may have larger parietal lobes associated with visual and spatial thinking. Females, on average, have larger Wernicke's and Broca's areas, the areas apparently responsible for language processing. Nonetheless, men and women apparently achieve similar IQ results, even using different parts of their brain. Recent research in genetics and endocrinology similarly report there are real differences between men and women, but then the scientists dispute about the significance, and maybe even about the findings themselves. The most recent direction in empirical research revives old radioactive issues of inherent gender difference. Marketed to mass audiences, books for parents and teachers report biological differences between boys and girls. This kind of work is described by critics as a revival of ideas that were debunked long ago. Lawrence Summers, previously my boss, gave a remark about this research, and he triggered such a firestorm that I think it's fair to say that precipitated his removal from his post as president of Harvard University, freeing him to turn to run the nation's economy. Psychologist Cordelia Fine wrote a book last year called Delusions of Gender, which notes how recent gender research echoes now rejected early 20th century speculations about inherent gender differences. She says there's just not enough known yet about the connections between brain structure and psychological function, and cultural ideas about gender continually affect even the research questions as well as the research findings. Books and articles claiming to find differences in male and female reasoning, emotions, and capabilities fail, she says, to pass basic standards of scientific accuracy and reliability. And as an example, she points to a recent claim by Leonard Sachs, who's a big advocate for single-sex education, who cites a neuroimaging study of maze navigation to justify teaching girls and boys math in different ways. She says, how do you get from one to the other? When it comes to individuals, neuroscientists can't tell a male and a female brain apart. It seems that a new field indeed has been launched, and it might be called neuro-nonsense. Yet journalists, editors, and book reviewers often don't even ask whether the popular reports of newfound hardwired gender differences are accurate. New claims of gender differences may be sloppy, or they may reflect backlash. Sociologists define backlash as popular negative reactions to something that's gained popularity or influence. And in most circles, it remains politically unpopular to express resentment of the increasing presence of women in higher education and the professions. Witness Larry Summers. Yet Susan Faludi's 1991 book, Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, documented resentment and retrenchment following gains from the women's movement. The book won the National Books Critics Award for General Nonfiction that year, and that's just about the time that the push for single-sex education began. 20 years later, it's hard to know what to make of the emergence of programs defended in terms of gender stereotypes. The revival of outmoded gender stereotypes by new single-sex educational initiatives is not a mere flight of the imagination. A Louisiana middle school proposed single-sex classes based on the view that boys are hunters and girls are mothers. This was 4 years ago. Perhaps this is an expression of backlash or instead opportunistic uses of a national trend to express some old-fashioned views. The ACLU threatened suit, the plan stopped. Reanimating gender stereotypes may be especially risky when you're talking about an all-boys school. One study of single-sex academies in the 1990s in California found that they perpetuated traditional gender stereotypes and reinforced macho cultural attitudes. Even all-girls schools, however strong the educational experience, may appear to outsiders to conform to gender stereotypes. Biology-based research proffered to justify single-sex education is especially galling to those who've worked for years to challenge the assumption of women's inferiority. The ACLU Women's Rights Project challenged the sex-segregated classroom practices of Breckinridge County Middle School, a public school in Kentucky. And Isabel Pinsler, once head of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, later a lawyer in President Clinton's Department of Justice, suggested that sex stereotyping is both a cause and effect of faith in single-sex schools. And she admitted that she'd been to one and she thought about sending her daughter to one. It's all very confusing. Second hypothesis for this revival. There are concerns about the status and educational progress of boys and men. Christine Hoff Sommers wrote a book in 2001 called The War Against Boys, and some people thought that was just a book about backlash against feminism. Its subtitle was How Misguided Feminism is Harming Our Young Men. And yet, studies by the U.S. Department of Education over the last decade and others indicate that male enrollment, performance, and work ethic in colleges and universities has declined. Educators ask whether elementary schools favor girls over boys by expecting quiet, orderly conduct, restricting physical movement in the classroom, and rewarding fine motor skills. The trend in public concern is clear. Marketed as both parenting advice and policy discussion, recent popular books include Why Boys Fail, Boys Adrift, The Trouble with Boys, The Mind of Boys. Need I go on? All-boy classrooms with male teachers are among the prescriptions in such works. Do we know if they work? Some studies indicate that boys do better academically in single-sex schools. Some studies suggest that girls don't. If that's true, what are we going to do then? Some suggest that we don't know. Few of the studies control for other factors. Most of the studies, for example, involve Catholic schools, which are a little bit different than other schools based on parental self-selection, curriculum, and mission. Hypothesis 3. Single-sex education is a response maybe to perceptions of growing sexualization of women and girls by mass media. The American Psychological Association in 2007 raised concern about the imposition of sexual images on ever younger children and linked this pattern particularly to risks for girls, including risks of impaired performance in mathematics and logical reasoning, and increased shame and anxiety about appearance and eating disorders and depression. Sexual harassment seems either on the rise or at least named newly. It's a legal wrong now in schools. One study indicates that 1/3 of middle and high school students may be victims of sexual harassment. The rising interest in single-sex education could reflect concerns about this or about distractions and harms from contact between girls and boys during puberty or after. What this rationale looks like in an era of greater acceptance of same-sex attractions and relationships is a topic for another day. Hypothesis 4. As a final guess about the revival of single-sex schooling, I wonder about its ties to racial, class, and religious differences in this country. Historically, single-sex education existed and has persisted, especially in elite private schools. Single-sex schools have been common in religious education, further complicating their attraction. Single-sex schools thus may be associated in the minds of many with excellence, and hence seem the way to open opportunities for disadvantaged children. Nowhere has the idea of single-sex options had more legs than as a way out of failing schools for poor children of color. Single-sex campuses and programs at historic black colleges similarly combine pride and identity with aspiration and achievement. The intersections of race, class, and gender are, to put it mildly, complicated. When white feminists fought the all-male public schools in Detroit, some wondered whether this reflected concerns for the girls in Detroit or instead remoteness from the concerns of the local community. Fans of single-sex education may be willing to invest in opportunities that disadvantaged children otherwise would not have. A state legislative initiative gave districts $500,000 to operate single-sex public schools, but no other money for any other innovations. A principal in that state acknowledged, "Why do I go for single-gendered schools? It's a great opportunity. It's money. I can do something." I haven't reached a settled view myself about the revival of single-sex schooling. The law school where I work once excluded women. I think it's a lot better now that it's coeducational. But I also know that among our most engaged and contributing students are graduates of Wellesley and Spelman, still all female colleges, and Morehouse and Yeshiva, still all male. Continuing problems with K through 12 education should make us open to experiments that hold promise of improved opportunities, especially for poor kids and immigrants. The school choice movement offers at least a temporary solution. The rhetoric of individual choice is a solvent of so many confusing and divisive issues in America. The availability of school choice relieves school systems from having to make a definitive judgment about single-sex education for all students. Inclusion of at least some single-sex schools give parents and students options, while also creating, frankly, a better basis for rigorous research. What remains troubling to me are the unthinking uses of old or new gender stereotypes in single-sex schools, and also involuntary assignments of kids to single-sex schools. Yet gender stereotypes, frankly, are also persistent in co-ed schools. Single-sex schools devoted to overturning stereotypes may wrongly relieve co-ed schools from promoting gender equality in all classrooms. With or without single-sex schools, pivotal questions of fairness and equal opportunity persist, as do challenges in forging the kind of social practices for the next generation that dismantle the prejudices of the last one. Delving into this issue, I have come to see the great wisdom in the demand for a searching inquiry into the uses of gender classifications. Maybe we shouldn't approve or disapprove single-sex schools across the board, and instead individual single-sex schools should have the burden of justification. And if so, they then should have to present strong, dare I say, exceedingly persuasive reasons. As Justice Ginsburg wrote in the VMI case, the justification must be genuine, not hypothesized or invented post hoc in response to litigation. And it must not rely on overbroad generalizations about the different talents, capacities, or preferences of males and females. I don't know if I've been persuasive tonight, but it has been my deep privilege to be here, and I look forward to your responses.